All right, welcome back to another episode in the Neurochemistry series. In this one, I wanted to talk about a finding that I see quite often in patients in regards to they come in, they're presenting with X, Y, and Z symptoms. And upon further questioning, we find out that their symptoms are affected by how much food or when they intake food, either feeling better or worse. So my name is Dr. Matthew Shim. I'm the owner of Peak Brain Performance Centers here in Colorado Springs. And the first thing we're going to talk about is blood sugar. So like we talked about before last week, whenever we talked about anemia, there are a couple things that our neurons need to kind of thrive and survive. And that's basically fuel and activation. So the example that I give is, let's say that we were preparing for a marathon. We would need to not only be fueling our body with the appropriate nutrients leading up to that race, but also preparing and training so that we are physically capable of running that marathon. And so, whenever it comes to fuel, particularly for the nervous system and for neurons in general, is broad category. It's glucose and oxygen. And so last week, whenever we talked about anemia, we talked about the oxygen component. And in this week, we're going to talk about the glucose component. So in this article, they wrote that once glucose is in the body, it travels through the blood and to energy requiring tissues. Glucose is broken down in a series of biomechanical reactions or biochemical reactions, releasing energy in the form of ATP. The ATP derived from these processes is used to fuel virtually every energy requiring process in the body. Okay. And so ATP is the form of energy that we use for all of our cells to be able to do the things that they need to do, right? And the important system in regards to blood sugar regulation is called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so this article states that the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, HPA axis, describes a complex set of positive and negative feedback influences between the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal gland. These positive and negative feedback mechanisms work in a neuroendocrine manner in order to modulate a number of physiological processes such as immunity, fertility, and the body's response to stress. Okay. And so how this system works, particularly when it relates to blood sugar, is let's say that I ingest some sort of food. Let's say I have this, hearty piece of cake, right? I eat this cake. It goes down into my stomach. It's digested. Then it goes into my small intestines. And from there, there's glucose particles or glucose that will seep through the integrity barrier of the intestines and go into the bloodstream, where we can then use that glucose for creating ATP and doing all of these other things that we need to do with glucose, right? And then we also have a system where if we don't, so that we don't use up all of the glucose in one sitting or run through it in a relatively quick manner, we have a way to put that glucose in storage. So just like, the holidays are coming up and everybody's bringing out their Thanksgiving or their Christmas decorations. And then whenever this is all over, they're going to go back in storage, right? And so the same thing kind of works in regards to the HPA axis, is we ingest this food, we get the glucose out of it, and then we use some of that glucose, and the stuff that we're not going to use, we put it into storage, okay? And particularly, we put it in the liver, in muscle tissue, and in fat cells. And so what happens is whenever my blood glucose levels are getting low, the brain, or particularly the hypothalamus inside of the brain, should detect it in the blood and say, our blood glucose levels are getting low. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to release this hormone CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, and I'm going to release it to the pituitary gland, which is the next step in that little system there on the left. And I'm going to release ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And then that's going to go to the adrenals, which sit right on top of the kidneys, to release cortisol. And cortisol is going to go to that storage facility, the liver, muscle tissue, and fat cells, to say, hey, we need some of this glucose to be able to use for whatever function we need to use it for. Okay. And then before we do that, in order to put it in storage, we have something called insulin. And insulin is like the key to the lock on the door that you're going to go put all of this extra glucose into storage. Okay. So we need insulin to be able to take the excessive amount of glucose into storage so that we can use it later, but also because excessive levels of glucose are toxic. And then whenever we need some more, the hypothalamus should sense it, and then all the way down to the adrenals release cortisol, and then cortisol goes and gets that glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, and then turns it into glucose, and then we can use it. for whatever function we need to, okay? So talking about two main things that I see in my office. The first thing we're going to talk about is insulin resistance, and some symptoms that you might be able to feel or things that you might experience whenever you have insulin resistance is one that's very, very common is you'll feel sleepy, tired, drowsy within 15 to 30 minutes after you ingest a meal. The next one is you may crave sugar after meals. The third one, wake up tired after 6 to 8 hours of sleep, ashy, flaky skin, losing hair in your limbs. And then in men, you might see erectile dysfunction and anorgasmia, or the inability to orgasm in women. And so what causes this? Well, it's particularly your food choices. And whenever we talked about insulin, insulin was that key, right? It was that key that opens the door so that we can put that excessive glucose into storage so that we can use it later. Well, the problem is whenever we ingest these types of foods that are high fat and high sugar that have a lot of glucose, our pancreas has to make a lot more insulin. And so there's only so long that your pancreas can keep producing this excessive amount of insulin before it just kind of wears out. It becomes a little fatigued and it just says, I can't make enough of this insulin to keep up to be able to put enough that glucose in storage. And so that's what happens with insulin resistance is you can have downregulation of the receptor numbers and resistance to the hormones being able to bind, or like the keyhole, you could have a resistance to where that key goes into the keyhole, and now you can't open the door to be able to store that insulin. And so what do we do about insulin resistance? Well, first, we got to stop eating such high glycemic index foods. We need to be able to lose weight because whenever the fat cells is one of the storage forms that we use, right? And whenever these fat cells get bigger, then the keyhole kind of changes. And so that's kind of where the whole insulin resistance thing comes from, is that keyhole changes. And now you need more of these keys, more insulin to be able to open up this door. And then whenever we lose weight, we lose these adipose tissue or fat cells, and then that keyhole goes back to the same that it was, and now we can use less insulin to open up the door. The third thing is exercise, so you can lose weight, dietary changes, de-inflaming, and then something that we'll probably talk about more later whenever we break down insulin resistance a little bit further than in this video, just so we don't make this video really long, is use nutrients that promote normoglycemia. The next thing that we'll talk about is something called reactive hypoglycemia. And reactive hypoglycemia, things that you'll typically see, is if a patient says, if I haven't ate in 3 or 4 hours, then I start getting symptomatic. And you may be hangry, that's a typical hangry. I may have a headache, shaky, lightheaded, irritable. I have an afternoon crash. I get headaches when I really exert myself. Or, very common, is I'll feel all of these symptoms, I'll eat some food, and then my symptoms go away. So I can alleviate some symptoms by having a nice meal, right? And causes of this is low HPA tone, really, the broad factor. And how you fix that, or how you would fix that just based on how the symptoms that you have and you notice that you feel better, is by eating more, right? Eating some sort of food so that you're not going through those lows of my blood sugar dipping really low. And so like we talked about before, is whenever you ingest food and then you get all this glucose out of the food, then your hypothalamus's job is to detect whenever that blood sugar is low so that you can make cortisol to go and get that glucose out of storage, right? Or glycogen that becomes glucose. And the problem with reactive hypoglycemia is, for one, which isn't as common, but for one, what could happen is you're making more insulin and now you're putting more glucose into storage to where now you don't have enough to actually use, right? Or what happens is you're not able to make enough cortisol to where then you don't have the ability to go to storage and get it out so that we can then use it, okay? And so low HPA tone, particularly that HPA axis that we talked about, there's some sort of problem there typically in the fact that hypothalamus, like we said before, is responsible for detecting low blood sugar. and then it has to go all the way down to the adrenals to make cortisol. And whenever that system is broken or skewy a little bit, that's when we can start noticing symptoms of reactive hypoglycemia. So what do we do for reactive hypoglycemia? The things that you would typically do for somebody that hasn't, seen some sort of provider, but they just notice that whenever I eat more often, I feel better. I eat food that has more protein in it versus sugar, no stimulants, get more sleep, I modulate my stress a little bit better, and then again, using nutrients that promote that normoglycemia that we'll touch on later in another class. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you're able to learn something and be able to differentiate the difference between insulin resistance and reactive hypoglycemia. If you have any other questions, feel free to email me or give my office a call. Other than that, I will see you in the next one.